Greetings and welcome to the Picks podcast for UFC 300. As always, I'm your host, Luca Fury, joined this time by Liam Heslin, and we're going to be breaking down the entire main card in depth. I'll also be giving some thoughts on some prelims as well. Forgive me for the sunglasses indoors, not trying to be cool here, but did have eye surgery recently, so can't quite see all that well, a bit sensitive to light, so going to be doing the podcast okay here, but bear with me if I'm having some issues reading your comments and stuff, but we will be getting to them, answering them in between the fights, so please share your comments, share your questions. We'll be getting to those all throughout the podcast. And of course, we'll be sharing our in-depth thoughts on every single main card bout here, as I mentioned. Also going to be giving some thoughts on some betting leans as well. But of course, if you do want our official plays, those are available over on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/FuriousFightPicks. More on that later. We want to get into the fight breakdowns here. Starting first with the main event, we have a good one. Alex Poatan taking on Jamal Hill, the former UFC light heavyweight champion against the current one. Interesting bout here on paper. Interesting in terms of the odds as well. It is about a pick'em. The current champion, Alex, is minus 130. Comeback on the former champion, Hill, is plus 110. We'll start first with you, Liam. Your thoughts on this fight in general, but also what do you expect from Hill coming back from the brutal Achilles injury?
I don't know. I think that's the hardest thing to handicap about this fight is exactly what version of Jamal Hill that we're going to see. I do think that Jamal Hill is a very talented fighter. I don't think he's always gotten the credit and respect that he deserves. I'm proud to say the one and only time he was an underdog in the UFC, I did bet on him against Jim the Brute Crute, and he broke his face in just a few minutes there. So very impressive stuff. He's delivered when people didn't see it. I also had many units on him against Thiago Santos. It was a back and forth fight. It was a war, but I took the younger guy who I thought had more left to give and who I thought had more routes to the victory. And he did end up finishing him on the ground there. So when I'm looking at a fight like this, I say to myself, man, both these guys are killers. Both these guys can go out there and get knockdowns. Both these guys can go out there and attack multiple levels of the body. You look at Alex Poatan Pereira. He's been fighting a very high level of competition, and he took body shots to Sean Strickland that opened up that left hook upstairs, was able to finish him. He basically debilitated the legs of Israel Adesanya in both of the fights that they had in the UFC. So he's shown himself to be very dangerous at multiple levels of the body. And then I always talk about the fact with an effortless left hook, he just knocked out Thomas Powell so bad the guy was asleep for like 6 minutes. And, I just look at this guy Pereira and I say, man, he's got great power. He's got excellent tools. But then you look at some of the defensive grappling and it's not really there. I do think that's a suspect part of his game. I think it's a concern. I thought he looked very vulnerable against Yuri Prohaska, but he also landed those low kicks. He also got those big shots off. And I'll tell you, Luca, if I was coming off of a surgical repair to my leg, I would not want to fight a really dangerous low kicker like Poatan Pereira. I would not want to fight somebody that can also knock you off balance with those big left hooks, with hooking combinations, with his body work. I think that all those things kind of point to, man, Alex is going to offer some real problems. But on the other side, Jamal Hill, he throws a little bit straighter with his shots. He might be able to get to the target faster. If he is healthy, if he is able to get that bounce, that pop off of his injured leg, then we should see him switching stances like he normally does, using, footwork, using his kicks. But I will say, sometimes the footwork gets a little bit sloppy. Sometimes the aggression causes Hill's chin to rise in the air. Sometimes he's out there throwing crazy shots with his chin up. And I do think both these guys have some defensive vulnerability. So for me, I'm most bullish that this fight is probably going to end inside the distance, not go over 3.5 rounds. I think this fight's going to go under 3.5 rounds. But if you want to know who's going to win the fight, watch on Saturday, because I'll tell you what, I don't have strong thoughts on who's going to win the fight. I did pick Poatan Pereira. I had to put a pick to Stone for my Roto Grinders article, but I don't feel great about this one. I think Jamal Hill, highly motivated, dangerous guy, 32 years old, championship experience, but you've got a very motivated Pereira on the other side as well. Wants to get revenge for Glover, wants to keep this train rolling, where he's gone into the UFC and basically produced a world-class legacy, a Hall of Fame legacy in the shortest amount of time of anybody in the company. So you look at a guy like that and it's kind of hard to doubt him. It's kind of hard to shit on him, but he's also 36 years old in a championship fight. He's also made a lot of money. He's also signing gambling deals with stake.com and all these fucking things that guys do before they lose fights. So I just think that there's, for me, no reason to go lay chalk to find out, right? I think the public side here is Pereira. So Hill could obviously win this fight. He's a knockout artist. He's a dangerous guy. But I think there's a couple question marks, some unknowns on both sides. So I feel like I would be getting just marginal value on the Hill side. I don't feel like I'd be getting supreme value at plus 150. Maybe we're having a different conversation, but very close line. I think that's appropriate. I would make this a pick 'em minus 110 either way. And, let these boys sort it out. I think it's a great fight. I think it's a great headliner. I think it's, going to end violently, just like we're all hoping and expecting for. But who's going to win it, man? I don't know.
Yeah, I think if we were not talking about Jamal Hill coming off of the Achilles injury, I might actually be picking him here. I think in terms of the skill-style matchup, it's very, very close. I think skill-wise, clearly Alex is the better technical striker, and it's actually really not even close in that margin. But in terms of the intangibles, the durability of Hill, which is some of the best in MMA, the power, the pace, the ability for Hill to get into firefights with guys like Thiago Santos, who's a brutal hitter himself, and basically just outlast him in a war of attrition where he's just both fighters are essentially bombing on each other, almost finishes multiple times from Hill, but not really Santos getting any near finishes himself because, again, Hill has such durability. So in terms of the skill, certainly it's in favor of Alex in terms of the striking, but overall intangibles, I think, actually favor Jamal Hill. That said, though, now you have Hill coming off of the brutal Achilles injury, which it has to be stated that this is not like other injuries we talk about in MMA. Yes, we talk about ACL injuries, we talk about shoulder injuries. Those are very bad. But those are injuries that athletes, not just in MMA, but other sports, recover from. Achilles is something different. I've known people in real life who have had them, and it's basically like your leg is done for. It just is never the same. Think of the number of pro athletes we've had who have actually recovered from them and been okay. You can basically count the number on one hand. So I think the injury cannot be understated here from Hill. I do not think that he's going to come back being the same guy. That's not to say that he won't be relatively the same and can still go out there and be an elite level light heavyweight, but I don't think we're going to see quite the same guy out there. I don't know if that comes to fruition in terms of maybe him having cardio issues that he didn't have before, if it's his movement just isn't the same, if there's some weakness with that leg. I'm not sure exactly how the issues will manifest, but I do expect there to be some issues as a result, just given the history of that injury. I don't think he's going to be some miracle, very few types of guys who actually recover fully from that. I will say that I actually did party with him in Vegas just a handful of months ago in December. Would never have guessed that this man was coming off of any kind of serious injury. He was dancing in the club for hours on end, like nothing happened. So, if I was to judge him based on that, I would say he's certainly no worse for wear. But obviously a fight is very, very different. But it is worth noting that it's a good sign because I've also seen fighters in Vegas before who are coming off of injuries. And I'm like, ooh, that is not someone I'm going to be picking in their next fight. So I guess positive signs from Jamal Hill in that case, but I still have some very big concerns about what version of him we're actually going to get here. In the case of Alex, certainly he's a better technical striker, but also he's a much more strategic one as well. Jamal Hill basically just goes out there and looks for opportunities, looks for exploitive opportunities from his opponents. They have their guard down, they get out of position. He's going to go with a good 1-2, maybe a combination. That's not what Alex is doing. He will do those if you give him those opportunities, of course, but he's going out there setting traps. What he did against Sean Strickland, for example, I did a fight film episode for that over on Patreon, breaking down the video. He masterfully baited him with jabs to the body, waited until Sean started overreacting, tricked him, and then went up to the head. It was about as brilliant of a strategic striking performance as you'll ever see, basically flawless. And that's the kind of stuff that he looks to do in every fight. When you look at the fights where he struggled in the striking, it's either been because he just got caught with a big shot or because a guy like, say, Israel Adesanya, a very technical, tactical striker himself, was able to pick apart some aspects of his game. But Jamal Hill just doesn't have the tactical or technical striking that Israel does. If he's going to catch Alex, it's going to be basically just on that brute power or catching him in an exchange. So I think we're probably going to see pretty much all striking here. If anyone shoots takedowns, I think it's more likely to be Hill. I don't think he probably will here, though, but it would be smart to at least just to mix it up and throw off the game of Poatan. But I think we're going to see all striking. I think that if we do see an extended battle, maybe we actually see some cardio issues from Hill. He has faded a little bit in 5-rounders before that were high-paced. Could potentially see that again, especially considering the injury layoff. So I just think there's a lot of things going against Hill here that already make a very, very close fight not exactly the clearest for him. So when I add on the injury issues for him, the layoff issues, the technical advantages for Alex, Ultimately, I ever so slightly have to go with Alex here to retain his title, but I think this is a very, very close fight on paper. I would not be surprised at all if it went the other way with Jamal Hill, but Alex by knockout in the first 3 rounds will be my official prediction. Anything you want to add to this, Liam?
I was just gonna say, did you happen to see Hill on the scale? Because I did think that he looked quite good physically, relative to my expectations. He normally carries like a layer of body fat, and I actually thought he looked pretty trim. And so I didn't know exactly what to make of that. It doesn't tell you he's going to win the fight, but it is something where I like to monitor the weigh-in and see how guys come in. I did think he came in looking like he's in great shape, and it kind of bolsters that confidence that he has. It's one thing if a guy has all this confidence and he's talking reckless and then he shows up looking like, he didn't train and he's got the beer gut and he's just here for the check and he's cutting promos. So, he gets called back next time. But I feel like in this spot, like Jamal Hill, I think the confidence is genuine. Whether it's going to materialize or not, that's still anybody's ball game. But
Yeah.
did you have any thoughts on his weigh-in performance?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but in the post-USADA era, it's always something on my mind anytime I see a guy coming in particularly good shape. I should note when in December when I saw him, he was absolutely a heavyweight back then. This dude was massive. I've seen Alex in person as well. At the time I met Jamal Hill, he was much bigger than Alex at that point. He was obviously, out of camp and everything, recovering from the injury still. So just about 4 months ago, he was certainly not anywhere close to this trim. He certainly put on quite a good training camp, got in very good shape. So whatever the reason for that is, whether it was just hard work or otherwise, I think it is safe to say that he's certainly been getting in some good reps in the gym. And again, goes to the point that maybe, again, there's probably going to be some issues from the Achilles, but maybe he actually goes out there and is still relatively at least the same form that he was in the past. But as for the co-main event, we have Zhang Weili, against Yao Xiaonan. We have very interesting one here in terms of the betting odds. Big favorite for Weili. She is about 6-1 favorite. I'm assuming both of us are going to be picking her to defend her title, but I'm curious your thoughts on the odds. Do you think those are too steep?
Yeah, I'm not going to pick her to defend her title. I
Interesting.
think that she could. I think she could. Absolutely. I think she's a great fighter. But yeah, I think the line is completely out of whack here. You look at, like, let's just imagine, she doesn't have the belt, right? We're just taking two women that both have the same resume in the UFC, 8-2 in the promotion. The one caveat you can give to Zhang Weili, her losses are slightly higher quality, right? She loses to Rose Namajunas not once, but twice. I took the bath, both times. Hey, Zhang Weili, number one pound for pound, gets head kicked in the first round. I was like, you know what? All right, maybe she didn't have it this time, but she's going to go out and do it for me the next time. Smaller favorite goes out and fumbles the bag again. Okay, so twice as a favorite, she's let you down in title fights, in big opportunities, in ones that mattered. But in any case, she's rallied, she rebounded, she got the wins over champions like Jan Jacek in a war, then in a finish, a violent one at that. She's done a great job. She's introduced her grappling, she's introduced wrestling to her performances. And I think that is the path of least resistance here. If she wants to, she's going to have to try and get this to the ground as often as possible. Because I believe that if you look at Yan Xiaonan, she's 8-2 in the promotion. Who did she lose to? She lost to Carla Esparza, world champion, one of the very best in the history of the division. I don't think that's disputed. Then you look at the fact, okay, she loses to Carla Esparza. Who does she rally back against? Marina Rodriguez. That was a split decision, and honestly, I thought she won the fight. So it was a close fight. It was back and forth. It was a competitive striking fight with Marina Rodriguez, who wants to strike, who wants to keep it on the feet. Yan Xiaonan was right there with her as a plus 230 underdog. And you look at these fights for Yan Xiaonan, that's her only loss in the UFC as an underdog. Split decision, very close. She was favored to beat Carla Esparza going into that fight. The reason being was because she hadn't been taken down. She hadn't been held down. She hadn't been beaten up by anybody. And Carla Esparza, you can correct me if you feel otherwise, but that was the most motivated version I've ever seen of her in her entire career. She came out with a mission. She wanted to finish the fight. She wanted to get to her dominant position. She was extremely aggressive. You could watch. She didn't throw as many strikes as she did from the top position against Yan Xiaonan in the entire Rose Namajunas fight, right? So it's just like you could watch these things and just like come away saying, man, was that the same version that fought Zhang Weili? Because I'll tell you, man, I thought Carla Esparza phoned it in that Zhang Weili fight. I thought she didn't want to be there. I thought she was ready to give up the strap. I thought she was ready to fold up the tent from minute one. And she looked like she was stoic like she always does. But she also looked like she didn't want to be there. And that's how she fought. She fought like she didn't want to be there. when I look at this kind of fight, man, I say Yan Xiaonan, meritocratic earning of this title shot, right? She didn't get it because she's a star. She didn't get it because she's like, talking up a big game. She got it because she deserves the shot. She's 8-2 in the promotion. She's fought a bunch of tough girls along the way. Claudia Gadelha knocked out Jessica Andrade in the first round, former champion. She's gotten the names on her resume. By the way, where's the huge difference maker? Again, I talked about the 2 losses. Maybe a slight difference there. What's the big win, the signature win? How did she get the title in the first place? Zhang Weili. She knocked out Jessica Andrade in the first round. But I would argue she, incurred more risk. Get in the pocket, throw like crazy, elbows. Like, she got really close to her and banged her out in the first round. Hey, hats off to you. But you look at how Yan Xiaonan approached it. She used footwork. She made her miss. She made her come to her, and then she banged her out with a single shot right hand as she was coming in that she never saw coming. And I just think that Yan Xiaonan can compete on the feet, no doubt about it. So the question is, will she get taken down consistently? She went, one fight where she got embarrassed on the mat. And did she say, I'm going back to my training camp because nothing's wrong? It was just a bad night at the office. No, she said, all right, I don't know how to wrestle and grapple like these other women. I got to get myself to Team Alpha Male. I got to get myself to the United States, get better training partners, get a better situation to prepare for these fights. And that's what she's done. Then she goes out there against world champion, one of the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners in the division, in Mackenzie Dern, and she wins the fight. And you know what people told me then? Who's Yan Xiaonan? Why is she fighting Mackenzie Dern? This girl sucks. Mackenzie Dern is Mark Zuckerberg's favorite fighter. She's a lock. She's going to win this fight. And I bet 4 units plus 200 on Yan Xiaonan, and she won a close fight. And maybe she's not going to go out there and dominate Zhang Weili. I think that is probably a low probability. Could she knock her out? Could she clip her? Yeah. I think Zhang Weili is a little bit chinny. I think she always has been. Ask Danielle Taylor how she felt about that big shot that she landed in that fight where she's, time traveling a little bit. Zhang Weili, recoverability off the charts, but she's been knocked out in the first round in the UFC. We all saw that. She's been rocked, wobbled, hurt a few times. She's been swollen up, hit with big shots. Who's had the harder run in the UFC? Zhang Weili. She's in war. She's in 5-rounders. She's getting beat up. And meanwhile, Yan Xiaonan is watching her. She's studying her. She's sitting at home going, I'll get this shot one day. Believe me. And she just kept plugging away. Now she's got the shot. Is she going to fumble it? Hey, who knows? We've seen Irene Aldana go out there and lay a complete egg. But this is not 34 against young up. It's 34 against 34. It's not massive girl against tiny. They're the same size. It's like, where is this huge advantage on paper? Grappling, wrestling. She just went out there against Amanda Lemos, who got submitted in the first round via standing arm triangle choke against Jessica Andrade. Let's be serious, right? And she had 5 rounds of dominant top time, beating the tar out of this woman. Couldn't submit her. So, yeah, I do think my point about Carla Esparza stands. I think that if Carla Esparza showed up her best, she doesn't get submitted in completely embarrassing fashion like that. That's my honest opinion. But she didn't show up with much vigor. She didn't show up with much piss and vinegar. She didn't want to be there. And so she kind of just phoned it in a little bit. She gave a half-hearted effort, and she lost the fight. Hats off to Zhang Weili. Hats off to the domination of Lemos. But it doesn't tell me that Lemos is like, oh, my God, Lemos was the girl. She was the... I think Yan Xiaonan is more deserving of a title shot than Amanda Lemos. But she's not as big a star. That's why she had to wait in line. That's why she had to earn it the hard way. I think she's going to surprise some people this weekend, and that's why I'm going to pick her to win this fight outright as an underdog, split decision type territory. I do think it's going to be a greasy one, but I also think that if somebody wins this fight via head kick KO in the first round, I think it's more likely to be Yan Xiaonan. So.
Well, speaking of female MMA fighters getting banged out, as you said, would you like to take this comment from YouTube over here?
Hey, brother, I could not do that. I got a beautiful young lady at home, so I appreciate the offer, though. I'm not going to find out what Kayla Harrison's all about. I wish her well,
though. Me as well. Can't answer that one. As for this fight, though, definitely can answer that. I agree with everything you said, pretty much. I'm ultimately going to go with Weili Zhang here in terms of my prediction, but I agree in the sense of, and I also said this in my article over on Patreon, she doesn't have any one big advantage in this fight. There's no single area we can point to. Okay, she keeps it on the feet. It's a slaughter. She gets to the ground. It's a slaughter. Gets it down the stretch. It's a one-sided or going to become more in her favor. There's really nothing that points to anything like that. So I do think that overall, though, if you look at these small edges, they do pile up for Weili, and that's ultimately why I'm going to pick her here. In terms of her being 5-1, 6-1 out there, I just don't understand that, other than the sense of she's much more well known. As you said, Yan has not been exactly the most hyped fighter. She hasn't gone out there and put on light the world on fire type of performances. Even when she's gotten the upsets, people just don't seem to walk away going, oh, wow, this is actually someone who actually is underrated, someone we should be taking more seriously. It's almost like they just kind of make excuses for why she won and never want to really give her credit. So I do think that she's certainly underrated here. I do think that Wei Li is not necessarily overrated. It's just that her opponent here is being underrated. And a big concern that I have for Zhang here is, as you mentioned, the Rose Namajunas performances. Not only did she go out there and get head kick KO'd by not just a head kick. It'd be one thing if she took the shin clean on the dome, went down, that's a wrap. Totally get that. But it was not a clean head kick in the sense of it landing on the shin. It landed with the very end of the foot, kind of like a slap. Tell me how many head kick KOs you see in MMA or even kickboxing where that happens. It does happen sometimes, but it's not when a fighter has a good chin. It's when the fighter has a poor chin. And we haven't really seen Zhang go out there and get hit with some big, hard shots all that often. And so that's something that has absolutely stood out in my mind. Of course, obviously, she had a chance to go out there and prove it was a total fluke. She was not able to do that, regardless of how you scored the rematch with Rose. So I certainly think that Wei Li has, again, the advantages overall in this fight. I certainly think in terms of female MMA fighters, she's one of the more well-rounded, solid fighters we've seen. I certainly think you're going to see a lot more fighters start to come up like her who are more well-rounded and not just specialists. But again, while she is very well-rounded, she doesn't have that one big advantage in this fight, and I am concerned potentially about her chin. And the thing when you have a chin issue, it could be the first minute of the fight, it could be the last minute of the fight, which means that you could be completely dominating for 24 minutes and 55 seconds, and in the last 5 seconds get chinned and KO'd. So it's not a situation where I would ever want to lay almost 5-1 or 6-1, depending what book you're talking about here. It's a female MMA fight, which tend to be more competitive than male fights. You don't see a lot of super dominant ones. Even when you see big favorites, they tend to be somewhat competitive at times. So that concerns me. The unreliability of Wei Li in the past also concerns me, and the chin of her also concerns me. So I will still be picking her here because, again, I do think she has small edges in pretty much every area, or at least most of them, but not any big enough, clear enough edge to warrant the price tag. When I'm laying 5-1, 6-1 on someone, I want it to be a situation where whether they're a striker or a grappler, I want it to be where if they're in their realm, they are dominant, and I also expect them to be in their realm at a high percentage of the time. I don't expect her to be in a dominant realm here, and even if she does find a realm where she's doing well, probably going to see some MMA here. We're probably going to see a mix of the grappling, clinches, and striking. So even if she is cruising in one area, there's probably potential for it to go into some other areas as well. So very interesting fight, more interesting than the line would indicate. Ultimately go with the champion to defend her title, but I do think we could be in potentially for a surprise here. Moving on to the next bet, we have honestly probably the best fight on the card, at least in my opinion. It is for the BMF title. It is Justin Gaethje taking on Max Holloway. Gaethje is the small favorite here, currently about -135. Comeback on Holloway +125.
Yeah, and this is one where I feel comfortable enough saying that on the service we tipped out Holloway +200 quite some time ago, and when you look, I think one of the skills in betting that you learn over time is timing the market, right? And that's not like trying to be Nostradamus or something. It's just trying to predict, hey, where is the action going to move on this fight? Is this line going to last? And oftentimes when you're betting underdogs, you're going to want to wait. You're going to want to be late in the market because underdog prices tend to peak as parlay liability comes in, as the public comes in on the big favorites. And in this case, it was an opportunity where I just looked and I said, you know what? I don't think this price is going to last. You got a public name in Max Holloway against another public name in Justin Gaethje. It's going to see competitive two-way action, but I felt the sharp action was going to come in on the side of Max Holloway. I did see some early takes from guys I respect that pushed this line up, right? It opens, the line gets pushed up significantly. It opened much closer. It gets pushed way up to -225, -250, and we've seen it come all the way back, right? And what I'm seeing in this fight is, a very competitive fight, right? I do see two guys that are both high level. You've got an elite lightweight in Justin Gaethje, who's gone out there and gotten the big knockout wins, but he's 35 years of age. He's not a spring chicken. He's had multiple brutal fights in the UFC, and he's trying to be a little bit more defensively sound and responsible in his recent fights. But I think that's out of necessity. I think he's getting hurt more in his fights. I think he's time traveled against Fiziev and Michael Chandler, but he was able to hold on in those fights. Those guys were kind of exhausted, or they had their own damage to worry about, like Fiziev, his eyes half hanging out of his face. But when you look at this guy, Justin Gaethje, he obviously is a very damaging striker. He can go out there and kick the legs. He can go out there and land big punches. He's kind of got an awkward style. Sometimes he is throwing big hooks. Sometimes he's trying to commit to short shots to the body. He kind of just mixes up his attacks. But when you look at Justin Gaethje, he's there to be hit. He does not do the right things defensively when it comes to kicks in terms of evading. Most of the time he just leans into them. He crashes into a lot of violence. And Max Holloway, is he a guy who's not known for putting a lot of volume out there to run into? I mean, I think that if Justin Gaethje is as aggressive as he normally is, he's going to run himself onto a lot of shots. I do think Max Holloway has a point to prove here in terms of his level of motivation. Why come back to 155 when you have the title shot all but secured now that the title changes hands at 145? I think it's because he's got a stick in his craw about the fact that he lost to Dustin Poirier. It was on short notice. Dustin Poirier is one of the top guys in the division, has been for the last, 6-7 years. And he lost him before, right? So that was another mental hurdle he had to try and overcome. He lost to this guy on the come up and got finished, only got to ever finish him in the featherweight division. So he made a huge improvement in that fight, right? He goes from getting finished at 145 to at 155, making a statement by saying, hey, I didn't win the fight, but we put on a fight of the year candidate. If it wasn't on the night that another great fight happened, it would be remembered even more. But it was a fantastic fight. I think hardcore fight fans know that. And you watch what Max Holloway was able to accomplish. He was able to put a lot of pressure on Dustin Poirier, in that fight. And Dustin is a soldier. He goes out there and deals with that, right? We saw against Dan Hooker. He was 2 rounds down, getting his ass whooped, and he said, I'm turning this around right now, and beat the tar out of that guy, put him in the hospital. So you look at Dustin Poirier, he could dig it out and go into the fire sometimes. He did the exact same thing against Justin Gaethje. And what's the difference? Justin Gaethje got finished, right? And now I know he flipped the script. I know last time out he head kicked the guy. But you just look at this guy's historical record, you have evidence that one guy breaks under pressure, and that's Justin Gaethje. And I don't mean any disrespect to a legendary fighter, a great fighter, a dangerous guy. He's got skills in all positions, but is his wrestling elite? I think people want to pretend that it is. I don't see evidence of that. He's got one takedown in the UFC. It was against Fiziev. It lasted like all but a half of a second, and he doesn't use it. He uses it defensively. He's got a good first layer scramble. He's a guy that's kind of hard to get a hold of. Once you do get a hold of him, his jiu-jitsu appears to be nil, zero, nothing. He's getting his guard passed. He's getting, terrible positions applied to him quickly, one series to another from Charles Oliveira. And I know Oliveira's up there in terms of the credibility. What about Khabib? As soon as he gets on top, again, doing whatever he wants. He's like guard pulling triangles against this guy. It just seemed like Justin Gaethje doesn't have very much once the fight gets to the mat in a extended exchange. And you look at a guy like Max Holloway, the opposite's true. He's a high-level black belt, right? He's a guy, or if he's not a black belt, he's a high-level brown belt. He's been on the mats for his entire career. He's been training with the Gracie Technic guys for a long time. He's got wins over credible black belts in the UFC via submission as well. So you look at this guy, Max Holloway, and you say to yourself, man, this guy is dangerous in all phases of the fight. Where is he a punk? You're going to knock him out? That's what everybody thinks. You're going to knock him out? Maybe. He's a heavy hitter. He's a big guy. He's a scary guy. He throws these hard low kicks. But one guy I've seen gassed out in 3 rounds, in 5 rounds. He's a guy that can go 5 rounds when he gets no resistance from Tony Ferguson after round 2. Tony dropped him in round 2, never had another moment of success the whole fight. And when you watch that fight, Justin Gaethje is like shocked that he's having so much success. It was like baffling to him that the fight was going that way. When you look at some of these fights for Justin Gaethje, he says, like, I hope I'm here again on Sunday morning. Like, that's a crazy way to think about fighting. And that's a guy who's willing to absorb a lot of damage. But Max Holloway can go all night. He's not a guy that's going to, Homer Simpson himself. I'm so tired from punching your face. He'll punch you a million times like Calvin Kattar. If you want to stand there and take him, by all means, I'll keep throwing him. But the other thing is, if you can't take him anymore and you start to make mistakes and you start to shoot, this guy will attempt front headlocks. This guy will spin behind you. He'll punch you in the face. And if he thinks you're getting the better of him on the feet, he will try and mix in the takedowns. He will try and switch the phase of the fight because he's a mixed martial artist and he's skilled in every position. So you give me plus 200 odds on a guy like that in a fight like this, where the motivation's high, where he's going to bring every skill he has to the table. I believe in Max Holloway. I think he's going to win this fight. And I think he's going to finish Justin Gaethje and remind everybody exactly who he is.
Yeah, it's interesting that he was such a big underdog at one point. I don't think that he should have been that high. I do think that him being an underdog could potentially make sense. Obviously, if you're talking about him moving up to 155, of course, didn't have the best success there earlier. So I understand it from that sense. But if you look at the actual style matchup here, as you mentioned, it's kind of tricky for Justin Gaethje. I know, obviously, he's known as the harder hitter, and past opponents of his have talked about how hard he hits and that he's the hardest hitter they've ever faced. But you're talking about guys who've been like knocked out by other fighters who are then saying he hits harder than the fighters who have knocked them out, which is kind of strange. And then if you also look at Gaethje's career, he's basically never been a one-hitter quitter type of guy, almost ever. There was the situation with, obviously, Poirier recently had kicked him and put him out. There was the Edson Barboza fight earlier in Gaethje's career where he put him out with one punch. But aside from those, you look at his stoppages, it's like 4-round and 5-round wars of attrition and back before he was in the UFC, or it's him just, putting together chains of combination round after round before eventually wearing and breaking down his opponent. He's not usually a guy who goes out there and gets the clean one-hitter quitter type of performances. And also, even when he gets the late stoppages, like I mentioned, like you said, Liam, he tends to actually slow down. He's usually fatigued at the point where he finally gets the stoppage. And like, man, you look at some of his fights against Palomino back in the day, they're bouts where you're talking about like, man, this could go either way at points in it, where you're thinking maybe actually Gaethje's going to be the one who gets stopped himself. And eventually his durability, his tenacity ends up winning out. So in terms of how clean they are in their performances, Max is just infinitely cleaner. And yes, I do agree that Gaethje hits harder, but I'm not really concerned about him going out there and one-hitter quittering Max. And if we're talking about him having to go out there and get 3, 4, 5 rounds of absolutely a brutal war to eventually stop Max, well, I think in that case, Max will actually be the better one down the stretch. I don't think he's going to have the worst cardio of the two. He shouldn't have the worst durability. And even though Max is not a big one-hitter quitter himself, he throws more volume than Gaethje. He throws generally a higher pace all throughout his bouts. He doesn't have these moments like Gaethje where he starts just getting basically beat up and swarmed on by his opponents. So I think if you look at the actual stylistic matchup, yes, of course, Gaethje is the more likely to get a one-hitter quitter type of knockout early on. But Max might actually be the more likely guy to get a stoppage when you consider the pace, the volume, the cardio down the stretch. I mean, if we're talking about Gaethje being in the position where we've seen him in the past, like say against Eddie Alvarez in a 3-rounder where he eventually got stopped because he was just completely gassed out. If Max Holloway has him in that point and we're at round 3, round 4, and round 5 left, I don't see how Max doesn't stop him in that case. Whereas, is Max really going to be worn down and brutalized in 4 and 5 himself? Probably not, because going back to his last fight at 155 against Poirier, where it is worth noting that Max is actually a 2-1 favorite there, got upset. Max got hit with some big shots, certainly got rocked, but was never close to being stopped. And still, despite being rocked at multiple points, came on late in the fight and actually had some moments. It ended up being a close competitive fight overall, despite the fact that Poirier absolutely had the biggest moments, the closest finishes. So if you look at that performance, you look at the other performances from Holloway, I think on paper he should actually be favored here. Do I think by a far margin? No, absolutely not. I think it should be a competitive fight on paper. Am I super confident in his ability to win? Again, no. I think this is a close fight on paper. But as you mentioned, you're going to give plus 200 on Holloway earlier when the line was released, or even around plus 130-ish now. I think he is the more likely winner on paper. I think that is the value side. So I think from a betting perspective, it's obviously dog or pass. From a picking perspective, I can understand if you can argue your way into picking Justin Gaethje here. I just cannot understand you arguing your way into actually favoring him in the matchup to the point where you think that there is value in the betting line. So Max Holloway will be my prediction. I think it could be by decision, but I think it also could legitimately be by stoppage down the stretch as well. Anything you want to add, Liam?
I'll also just say, we did well with the prop movement on this fight as well. I won't give away everything that we're looking at there, but it's something where the value, again, could be early on in a market when these domestics try and get ahead of a big event like this. And so understanding how the market's going to shape up is a critical skill. And it's something I'm very proud of. Win, lose, or draw on these bets, when you're beating the market, by double, you have double the price that's available. That's just a good feeling, whether it wins or loses, just because the market's endorsing your positions. And that's how I feel about this fight. You look at the opener on Bet Online compared to the price that I got on some of these props, it's like a difference of $7. It's insane.
Yeah, I think closing line value is something that gets a bit overrated at times. Sometimes people use that as like the sole indicator of, oh, hey, I'm sharp because I beat the closing line. Well, you could be a legitimate square who's a long-term loser who's never won a single year. And if you just pound the openers when they are first released with tiny limits, you can technically beat the closing line value on the majority of your bets and still be an absolute square and lose. So closing line value is certainly an indication of a sharp better. If you are a sharp better long term, you are generally going to beat the closing line, but it is not the be all end all. In terms of the question about Jan earlier, I forgot to answer this one when we discussed that fight. I'm assuming we're both on the same page that we definitely think that it's a possibility that if Jan wins, it is by stoppage, correct?
I mean, it's certainly possible. But I always just think of the concept of it's a plus 400 money line, essentially. Like, do you really want to get cute? Maybe if you have the money line and you want to stack that, you want to say, hey, I'll put a quarter unit here, on the upside that she finishes, hey, no problem. Or if you want to say, hey, I just don't want to have much risk on this fight, so I'll take the downside risk that if it goes to decision and it's close, whatever, but I'll take the finishing upside, no problem. But for me, the way I would target it is not getting cute. I would just take the money line if I like that side. And then hope that she wins by hook or by crook or by disqualification or, sniper, like literally anything. You cash a ticket. That's what you're looking for with the money line. Whereas the inside the distance, I mean, think about that Chris Weidman fight where they're screwing you around. You got to call the sports book 50 times. Like the money line, they've got to give you the money.
Yeah, I think if this was, say, a situation where Jan was like plus 110, I'd be like, okay, you're talking about a serious difference at that point. You can already get like plus 400, plus 450, depending on the book. So as you mentioned, I wouldn't say I'm opposed to sprinkling some on the prop. Usually that's what I'll do if I like an underdog. Also, I like the value on the prop, so I'll bet the majority on the money line and then a smaller amount on the prop. Partly I do that just because of the size of the limits, but even from a strategical standpoint, I'd be doing that anyway. If she is to win, I think there's a good chance it would be by stoppage. Again, as we talked about, the chin from Weili, I can't get that Rose performance out of my mind. And again, she hasn't taken that many hard shots aside from that. So I don't know if that was just a fluky situation. She had a bad weight cut. Maybe she had gotten rocked in camp going into that. But Rose is not a huge one-hitter quitter person herself. I know she's rocked fighters with head kicks, but again, kind of hit with the toes there. So that does concern me. And the boxing of Jan could potentially lead to her getting rocked or stopped there. In terms of the next fight, that will be another very good one. Obviously, very stacked card here overall. I do think that some of the opinions on it where people have said it's a bit disappointing, I do think they're valid in the sense that it doesn't have, say, a Conor McGregor, a Ronda Rousey type, absolute star power at the top of it. But in terms of every bout on this card, it's one of the most consistently great cards the UFC has ever done. UFC 100 and 200 are obviously very stacked as well, but I think in terms of every single individual fight, this is probably the most stacked card in UFC history. But I also, again, at the same time, do agree with people that it would have been nice if it had, that absolutely massive star power at the top. Alex versus Hill, great fight, but not quite the headliner you expect for a 300 type of event. But the next bet on the card, again, a fantastic one. We have Arman Tsarukyan at minus 225, taking on Charles Oliveira at plus 185. Quickly, before we get to that bout, do want to remind you guys that we do have the live stream and some other free content we do. We do have a Patreon over at patreon.com/Fury's Fight Picks. We have a bunch more content available. Picks, articles, fight film analysis, and of course the official bets as well. All third-party tracked and verified. Have a bunch up right now, not just for UFC 300, but also PFL, which is going down tonight, Friday. All third-party tracked and verified up on the year 2024, up big long term. We have multiple handicappers on the site as well. Combined, we have almost 30 years of long-term proven results, including almost all of those being third-party tracked and verified. So again, check it out, patreon.com/Fury's Fight Picks. But moving on to Tsarukyan versus Oliveira. Fantastic one here. What are your thoughts, Liam?
Great fight. I do think this fight could go either way. This isn't as bullish a take as some of my other takes, especially on the underdog sides. But Make it 3 in a row for me, man. I'm going with Charles do Bronx Oliveira. And the reason I'm doing that, Luca, is because number one, he's the biggest star on this card. It's not close. When you look at the metrics on social media, obviously you've got champions above him. You've got guys that are, stealing the show, so to speak, with Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway. That's the fight I think that's drawing the most attention. But you can only have a fight as big as your dance partner, right? And who's the A side in this matchup? It's not close. It's Charles Oliveira. And what is the UFC doing with this matchup? I believe they're trying to set up a match where either guy could win, and Arman Tsarukyan could use this as a springboard. Man, this guy's shooting to the moon if he beats Charles Oliveira. If he finishes him, forget about it, right? This guy's getting the title shot. He's fighting Islam Makhachev. He's building up his name. But right now, guys, if you ask the average UFC fan, they don't know an Arman Tsarukyan from, the change in the couch cushions. That's the truth. And the difference is Charles Oliveira is a household name. He's a UFC legend. He is a absolute first ballot Hall of Famer. And the reason being is he grew up in the UFC. He fought at 145. He fought at 155 when they were premier divisions in the sport. He's fought everybody and he's beaten most of them. He's finished UFC champions over and over. He's beaten these guys that are very quality fighters in title fights, in fights that matter. On the nights that matter, he shows up and beats people that are great fighters. And I think that in this spot, man, it's an uphill battle. Because Arman Tsarukyan, he really wants it. He's a tough kid. He's got great skills. He's got great wrestling. But you look at the things that I think could hold him back. Let's just objectively talk about his resume. Matt Frevola, great fighter, excellent fighter, as a matter of fact. But Matt Frevola has been chin-checked by a couple guys a little bit lower on the ladder. He went the full 15 minutes with Matt, right? He had to scramble, grapple, go. I think he had to get 10 takedowns on Matt Frevola to get through the 15 minutes there, right? You look at the Neto BJJ fight. What is Charles Oliveira if not a bigger, scarier, more lethal version of Neto BJJ? And this guy absolutely rocked Arman Tsarukyan with a punch, sent him wobbling, sent him stumbling backwards. But Neto BJJ is not Charles Oliveira. He doesn't have all these records for finishing people. He doesn't have these great world-class finishing instincts. He's got excellent grappling, right? Neto BJJ, earned nickname. He can go out there and submit Neil Magny up a weight class in a grappling match. But when it comes to striking, this guy gets hurt. He gets clipped. He gets rocked. So Arman Tsarukyan justified the minus 1,000, right? He was able to get rocked so bad that he almost fell out of the octagon, and then he was still able to take the guy down, control from on top, and dominate the fight. So that's a minus 1,000 if I've ever seen one, right? But are you going to be able to do that against Charles Oliveira? The question I have is, does he take him down and dominate him from second one till the end? Because if he's not doing that, he's got the most dangerous finisher, the most proven finisher in UFC history standing in front of him, throwing knees, elbows, kicks, everything that you want, everything that you could possibly imagine offensively will be coming back his way. And defensively, there's some liabilities on both sides. I think both guys take some risks. I think both guys take chances, but I think one guy might be falling in love with his hands. Arman Tsarukyan goes out there and takes the sloppy seconds, with all due respect, of my guy Charles Oliveira. He knocked out Beneil Dariush. Then Beneil was like, no, fuck it, I'll do it again. Like, run me out there again 2 months later. Like, whatever, I'll figure it out. Bad idea. Terrible career management. Nobody did him any favors there. And they threw him out there against a young, hungry lion, and he got knocked out again. But it didn't tell me Arman Tsarukyan is now Mike Tyson. Like, yeah, he's a good fighter. He's a good striker. He's got power. He's got real skills, and he could win this fight and make it look easy. But if he doesn't do that, I think he's getting finished by Charles Oliveira, who's a prolific finisher, who's an all-timer in this division, and who's a huge star in the UFC. I think if the UFC can promote Charles Oliveira doing the dance one more time, going out there and grave digging somebody, here's the truth. Arman Tsarukyan's 28 years of age, and if he loses this fight, he gets 2-3 more wins. He's back in the title conversation. He still has the same exact talking point, which is, when I fought Islam Makhachev, the guy in question, I did great. If he loses to Charles Oliveira, it will remind everybody styles make fights. And he's fighting one of the most dangerous guys on the feet, on the ground, whichever way you want to do it. So let's find out. Charles Oliveira.
Yeah, this one is really tough for me. On one hand, I look at Oliveira and go, okay, who's the more likely to finish on the feet? By far, Charles, not even close there. I mean, talk about punching power, finishing instincts. I mean, Charles Oliveira, funny enough, has turned into a very dangerous striker, actually knocked down Justin Gaethje. We just talked about earlier. Gaethje, obviously relatively durable. I would not have expected Oliveira to go out there and knock him down like that, but it just goes to show some of the power, certainly, that Oliveira does possess. He certainly seemed to have worked on his striking a lot more in recent years. Knocked down Michael Chandler, of course, as well, finished him. So in terms of the striking, we've seen Arman get rocked before. He does have generally solid striking, but he is not a particularly potent offensive striker, not too dangerous in that regard. So certainly Oliveira, much more dangerous in terms of the knockout threat. In terms of submission threat, obviously, he is one of the most prolific submission artists we've ever seen in MMA or the UFC, going out there and doing what he did to the likes of Hatsuki Yoki, a legitimate top-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, great submission artist himself, and hitting him with modified chokes in that and getting the tap out, being the first to tap out Hioki as well. Performances like that really go to show you the type of skills that Oliveira possesses on the mat. So in terms of finishing ability, striking, or the grappling, obviously Oliveira is the clear favorite in that regard. However, something that is concerning about me, well, there's two things. One, his history versus good top position control. Paul Felder went out there, and Paul Felder is certainly no, prime GSP from top position with elite control and takedown ability, certainly not any kind of vicious ground and pound offense that he's known for. And he basically went out there, got on top of Oliveira, smothered him, and then stopped him with strikes. Like, that's a weird performance. And if he can do that, makes you wonder who else might be able to go and do something like that. Then look at the fight against Islam, who was able to go out there and actually submit Oliveira from top position. Granted, he rocked him first, but still got on top, got the submission, also had some other grappling success there as well. You look at the Nick Lentz fights back in the day. Oliveira, yes, he's improved a lot in recent years in terms of his striking. He's been kind of the same grappler for many years now. And even back in the day, a guy like Nick Lentz actually gave him some tough moments there just based on his top position grappling and wrestling. And again, certainly not an elite level top position grappler and Lentz there either. So there has been a bit of a trend with Oliveira in terms of these guys who have good submission defense, who can get on top of him. And oftentimes Oliveira is willing to let them on top of him to try to work his ground game. And when that happens, if they have good submission defense and they have good top position grappling, not like Hatsuki Yoki, who's a very good top position grappler in terms of submissions, but not so much in terms of control, not so much in terms of stifling opponents. He's more of a guard passer, get your back, get submissions himself. But when he goes against these more wrestler archetypes, guys who will sit in his guard or sit in half guard and just stifle him, not try to pass and give him the opportunities to lock up a submission or something in a scramble, he has tended to struggle a bit. And so that is ultimately why I will go with Tsarukyan in terms of a pure prediction here. But in terms of a bet, I do think it's dog or pass once again. Also, one thing about Oliveira, it's something I've been mentioning in recent fights of his. You can kind of tell if he's going to win a fight based on the first minute or two of his performances, regardless of what's happened in terms of the action. When you look at literally just the look on his face, he is either confident or he is not. I'm not exaggerating. Go back and watch his performances where he's won and looked good. You will see he has a confidence about him. It looks like he almost already knows he's going to win the fight. But then go look at his performances like the last one against Islam and see what happens when he loses and see how his facial expressions are. See how his performance in the cage is. He looks like a guy who already knows, like almost like the script's been written and he's going to lose. There's no confidence, no swagger to his game. And so something that I always look for in his fights is not necessarily to bet them pre-fight, but I like to live bet them based on how he looks in that first minute or so. It is a very consistent trend, not the be-all, end-all. There's been outlier performances, but generally speaking, if this man looks confident and assertive in the first minute or two, he wins his fights. If he doesn't, he does not win his fights. And so that I think early on, Arman's probably going to be a bit not hesitant, not gun shy, but a bit careful. Obviously doesn't want to run into something on the feet. Obviously wants to carefully pick his takedown so he doesn't get caught in a choke on the way down. So I think for the first minute or two, we will actually get a chance to gauge what Oliveira is bringing to the table. If he is confident and assertive and moving forward, or if he looks a bit hesitant, a bit gun shy. I will say so far, in terms of how he's looked at the press conferences and everything, he has looked supremely confident, about the most assertive I've ever seen him going into a fight. Still, there's been times in the past where that's been the case during fight week, and then once he's in the cage, you can literally see during the walkout, the panic in his eyes, they're as big as saucers. So that's what I'll be looking forward to in this fight in terms of making a bet. I do think on paper it is dog or pass. I think that Oliveira, again, much more potent, much more dangerous finisher on the feet. I think he is also much more potent and dangerous of a finisher on the ground, but if he does not have his confidence, if he is the flaky version of himself, the guy who has looked for a way out in the past, gotten submitted by guys he shouldn't get submitted against, gotten knocked out in weird situations. Again, situation I'll never get out of my mind was against Cub Swanson, where he gets hit with a big punch and then takes multiple steps and pretends to be knocked out because it was a delayed reaction from the pain of his orbital bone. He broke his orbital bone in that fight. He was not knocked out. He just went down from the pain, and he waited a couple of seconds till the pain hit to go down. The man literally faked being knocked out, like the most dramatic, like, ah, when he hit the ground, to fake being knocked out because of a pain stoppage. So again, there's been multiple instances of this man just not showing up in terms of heart or his mental game. I know he's looked better in that regard in recent performances, getting rocked by guys like Chandler and still coming back to win, but it is still something in my mind that concerns me. So in terms of a betting perspective, I'll be looking to live bet this one. I do think it's dog or pass on paper, but in terms of official prediction, I will go with Arman Tsarukyan, probably by decision. Anything to add, Liam?
No, I think that that's fair. I honestly would just say, like, I think somebody's going to get finished more often than not in this fight. That's just the way Charles fights. Kill or be killed, all or nothing, on your shield or with it. So I think Charles is probably going to spend himself for victory or find himself defeated in the second or third round.
Yeah, I have a tough time between the decision and stoppages because I agree with what you said in terms of what I broke down as well. I mean, we've seen Oliveira go out there and get stopped by guys he shouldn't get stopped against. I just concerned about how safe Arman is going to play it. We just saw him recently as a massive favorite go out there, play it safe for a good portion in that fight. So
you know what I have to do, man? I have to go to bat for my guy, the Irish Dragon, Paul Felder. I mean, this is a pseudo welterweight who is basically like a big ass guy. And the one thing I'll give as caveat, if you remember, Oliveira, I've always said this and people disagree with me, but the UFC uses people like hitmen. Like if they think you can beat somebody and they want them gone or they want them embarrassed or they want them beat, they will use you. And
if anybody doubts that, by the way, go check out like the leaked emails from the UFC like lawsuit stuff. I mean, anybody who doubts that, I mean, you're just blatantly ignorant. There's nothing else to say.
Exactly. I can't educate people on it anymore. I've actually posted those emails and documents before for that reason. But when you're what was my train of thought here? What were we just talking about? Felder. Thank you. When you're looking at a guy like Felder, right? He was coming in, big guy, back and forth. He fought Mike Perry at 170. But then you look at this guy, Charles Oliveira. He was at 145. He was having some up and down results. Guys, he was cutting way too much weight. Do you see the size of this man? He's huge. But when you cut a lot of weight, you have to teach your body then, like, let's gain some weight back. Like, let's be bigger. Let's walk around at a bigger weight. And it takes time. Like for Max Holloway, he said, I wanted 8 weeks, 10 weeks of training camp so I could put on some muscle, so I can have some protein, so I can do some lifting, like the things that are normal body composition things. And Charles Oliveira weighed in for the Will Brooks fight, which I believe is his first UFC fight up in the lightweight division for some time after being at featherweight. And he goes out there and finishes him in the first round. He weighed 152.5 pounds. He was not even 155. He didn't even get back up to the weight class properly, or he overcut. His body was just not in proper management. So he goes out there against Paul Felder and he gets diddy bopped, leading to a 12-1 run in the UFC's hardest division. That's what this guy's done. So again, it's like, could he be, over the line here? Sure. But because this guy went close with Islam Makhachev back in the day and knocked out Beneil Dariush after Charles did it, he's the second coming. I think he's a great fighter. But I bet Demiris Magulov against him before I knew Demiris Magulov was one fight away from retirement. I just feel like he's a great fighter that people, are very confident on. But I think he's an aggressive guy, a risk taker. And I just think that could get you caught against a guy like Charles. So great fight, man. Great matchmaking.
Yeah, really, really good one here. In terms of the question here from James, do you think the increased bonuses will affect any fighter's performance? I would say certainly, but not on some of the bigger fights. A guy like, Hill or Alex in the main event, they have much bigger stakes there than the 300K. Their paydays are bigger than that as well. Not just in terms of what they make from the UFC, but their sponsorships outside the cage. You wouldn't have liked any title really in the UFC. Outside, I guess, maybe some of the female ones or the lighter men's ones. If you're like a light heavyweight champion, middleweight champion, heavyweight champion, yes, you can't really get the sponsorships in the cage anymore outside the official ones, but they still have the Instagram sponsorships, the social media, the other ones. I mean, there's so much money that is on the line if you actually win the fight as a champion and get to keep your title. Not to mention, of course, just the increased contract you get from the UFC, the pay-per-view cut and all of that. So a fight like, say, Hill or Weili Zhang, they're probably not going to be too incentivized by that. I mean, maybe, there's a situation where they wouldn't necessarily be gunning for the finish. It's round 5. They put in just a little bit extra effort, but I wouldn't really expect to see much in that regard. But some of the lower fighters on the card, some of the ones who are certainly not at that championship level, they don't have the serious stakes in their matchup. They don't have the massive paydays. I definitely think you might actually see not just a difference in terms of the matchup, but like a noticeable concerted effort from guys maybe going out there trying to finish in certain spots. Your thoughts, Liam?
Yeah, I think that when you have a big crowd, people are already going to be incentivized to go crazy,
Mhm.
brawl it out, try and finish, have fun fights. And the other thing you got to remember is it's not all about finishes. I do think I'm hearing everybody like, "Oh my God, now bet every fight to end inside the distance." I mean, that's one way to approach it. But for
Mhm.
me, I would just stick to your process, whatever you thought about the fight prior to this knowledge, because the truth is, like, going out there and having a fight of the night is just as good. I have a fight of the night, they give me the same 300,000. It's like I'll take the money, right? So it does. If I have to finish my opponent, that's really hard, especially when you're talking about elite fighters, which is what we have. Maybe they have some skill mismatches, some disparities, some positional advantages. Those are things you got to take in mind. Cardio, the things that you normally want to look for in somebody that could go out there and finish. But I just don't want to overread that. If I could be frank, I have seen so many questions about this, like all over Twitter, like, what do we make of this? In every group chat I'm in, like, yo, boys, like every fight's ending inside the distance, right? Like, I just don't see it. Like, it just seems to me like people are going to go out there and fight, and things are going to happen, and everybody wants a knockout, right? Like, who goes to their media day and they're like, you know what, I'd really love? I'd love a decision. Like, we
Mhm.
we we mock those guys. Those guys are we don't like those guys. So I think that this is a spot where we're going to see everybody wanting to get a finish, wanting to have a crazy fight, wanting to be in the best fight of the night, wanting to be, the most explosive finisher. I think that's true every UFC card. And I think that in front of a crowd, it's just getting turned up a notch. I think there's a 300K. It's just like another drop in the bucket of all the reasons why I think this is going to be a crazy card.
Yeah, I would definitely say don't change your betting process based on this. I don't think it's a significant enough of a change to do that. But we've seen you say in the past, like I mentioned, maybe there's like that late round situation where you see a guy, maybe he's up, 2 rounds to 0. There's 2 minutes left. He's in like a loose half guard. You're like, maybe you bet inside the distance in that spot. You're like, come on, dude, you can pass the guard. He's just kind of sitting there with little pity patter shots and doesn't, really ever attempt to finish. Goes to the easy 30-27 type of decision. Those are the cases where maybe we see, again, more of a concerted effort from a guy to try to get that late finish, try to get maybe a performance bonus. But again, these are fighters who already want to go out there, be as impressive as possible, not just for the fan base, but to get good favor with the UFC, try to get in highlights, build their brand. So again, look at past MMA fights and notice how we don't really have guys blatantly going out there and trying to coast to decisions all that often. When you see those situations, it's kind of, a specific spot where, again, like I mentioned, a guy up 2 rounds to 0 or something, he's 2 minutes away from a decision, he just is going to coast. This is the type of spot where maybe that's a difference, but again, not enough to adjust your whole process, not to go, oh, I think this fight's going to end by decision, but now all of a sudden I'm going to bet it by stoppage. It's not that big of a difference. Maybe we're talking about single-digit percentage points in terms of how much more likely a fight is to end in a finish, but nothing particularly groundbreaking here. In terms of Hill and his ring rust Achilles injury, kind of discussed that already in that breakdown. So if you missed that, you could either rewind or catch that on the replay. But I seem to be a bit more concerned by it than Liam, but both of us did have some concerns. That's correct, right?
Oh, I mean, I picked Pereira to win the fight, so yeah, I would say I'm marginally concerned about it, but it's also just a weird, volatile fight, and I don't have the highest level of confidence anyway. It's one of the things I think contributes to the need for the line to be close, which is unknowns. Unknown should push the line a little closer to 50-50, and it's an unknown. And I would say it's a less than optimistic unknown, which is why I picked the favorite and the current champion. But I respect Jamal Hill. I think his game is great. I think he's going to be, fighting for titles again. So it's just a bump along the road, but, let's see how he performs. It's all well and good to look good physically on the scales, but fighting is a damage based sport. And I want to see him take the damage before I trust him in this spot.
Yeah, as I mentioned, he looked great when I was partying at a club with in Vegas just a handful of months ago. But fighting is a completely different ball game. What happens if he gets kicked with that? What happens if he just steps on it the wrong way, trying to explode into a massive power punch? I mean, it's very, very different. But I will say again, from what I saw there, I would never guess he was coming off of an injury. So that does give me some hope that maybe he'll be at least a decent version of himself. But I still have legitimate concerns there. In terms of being the post-USADA era, that is, I guess, something that might actually help him. In terms of the value on older fighters, I actually did a recent Lucas Lecture episode on this. I did 2 of them on the recent changes to the drug testing, one before it was implemented, once we knew it was going to be, and then one more recently, just actually last week, where I discussed some of the changes we've already seen. So back when USADA came over originally in 2015, I went on like an absolutely legendary run of betting fights to end inside the distance over the course of 9 months. I think it was 91% on those with average odds of minus 130, which is just unreal. All third party tracked and verified. So, I mean, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't believe anybody who went on a run like that. But the reason why that run was a sort of one-time thing for me in terms of the inside the distances is because it was directly a response to USADA. People did not realize that now that USADA was implemented, that all these guys who were juicing before could not juice before, at least not to the same extent. They are going to show signs for that. And those signs are going to come in, yes, maybe they're not as explosive, maybe they're not as powerful, not as muscular, which leads some people to think, oh, less finishes. But no, it's the opposite. Now they're much less durable. Their bodies are breaking down. Their chins are not as good. Their cardio is not nearly as strong. And what we saw was repeatedly these guys going out there, getting finished in effortless fashion, gassing out in 1 minute, or excuse me, 1 round, 1.5 rounds, being just complete dead body zombies for the second half of the fight, getting finished effortlessly by guys who aren't even big finishers. And I absolutely crushed that strategy for, again, almost a year until finally the odds makers adjusted. It was absurd how they did not adjust for so long. So now we have the reverse happening. Now USADA's gone. Yes, the UFC has their new drug testing policy. It is not as strict as USADA. Look at the number of tests for their high-level fighters, the champions. You have guys like Alex being tested only 2 times so far this year, when last year, if this was USADA, he would have been tested, dozens of times as we were seeing. So seems like the UFC is not trying to, test their big names as much, not test the champions as much, and, try to basically give them less of a chance of getting caught and cards getting canceled, which I understand for their bottom dollar. But you as a sports bettor need to understand then, okay, some guys who maybe go out there and have had really bad cardio in recent years or really bad durability or have just looked totally washed, they might now actually turn back the clock and look better. And that is what we have seen so far in 2024 with some of these fighters. Don't want to name names, don't want to make accusations, but there's been some guys who suddenly turned back the clock in some mysterious or not so mysterious ways. So in terms of USADA and the post-USADA, I guess I should say, effect on the fighters, I definitely think that's something you should be noting in terms of your handicapping. If you see guys, say, who looked a certain way in recent years suddenly have a particularly good performance early in 2024, normally I'd say maybe that's an outlier. Don't pay too much attention to it. Maybe actually pay more attention to those in those situations in these cases. So if you want more information about that, again, check out my recent Lucas lecture episode over on patreon.com/Fury's Fight Picks. But aside from that, do you have any further thoughts on the post-USADA era from the fighters here, Liam?
Everybody's on steroids, to quote a great man.
Yeah, Nick Diaz back in the day said it very, very accurately. All you MFers are on steroids. Question here from Jake. Should buy a bottle of Howler Head or Puncher's Chance whiskey for the watch party? I've actually not had either of those. Do you have experience with them, Liam?
I've never had a celebrity alcohol brand except for proper number 12, and that's because the Irish got to stick together. But it was not very good. I wouldn't recommend it to a friend.
I've heard mixed things about some of the UFC sponsored alcohols, although not to be, I guess, unexpected, I suppose. Moving on with the rest of the card here, we have not so great of a fight here. Great card overall for UFC 300. Obviously, everyone we've talked about so far, banger after banger. But next one, we have Bo Nickel as one of the biggest favorites in UFC history. Was actually earlier in the week the biggest favorite in UFC history. Currently sitting over at about minus 1,600. He's taken on Cody Brundage, plus 900. I don't think it's going to be surprising who we're picking here, but I guess mainly our thoughts here, and this one, the more curious thoughts for the listeners would be, what do we really think of Bo Nickel as a prospect, and does Brundage have any kind of legitimate shot at an upset outside of something completely flukish?
I have a different opinion on mixed martial arts than a lot of people. And I just don't think that this is a sport where people are minus 2,500 very often. It doesn't matter how good they are. It doesn't matter if they're better at fighting. Fighting is just inherently a pretty stupid thing to do. And I say that with love and respect for the game. But when you're talking about the fact that you could be the better fighter, you could have better skills, you could have better athleticism, better tools, everything like that. You get hit on the jaw one time, you go to sleep, you wake up, they're shaking you. Hey, buddy, it didn't work out your way. Doesn't matter, right? You could be the better guy and lose the fight. So when you look at a guy like Bo Nickel, is he the better guy? I mean, let's be serious. Of course he's the better guy. What is Cody Brundage good at? He's good at memeing first round finishes, and I respect him for it, right? Like the win against Tresean Gore, that's just a clean win. Like Tresean Gore, not a very experienced guy, kind of like Bo Nickel, athletic, has some skills, but not as highly touted, right? He was supposed to be like the big guy on Tough. Then he lost to Brian Battle after Brian Battle won the show in his absence. So Brian Battle's the real man on Tough that season, baddest man in North Carolina. Never forget that. But when you're looking at this fight, I'm like, man, Bo Nickel is a guy that has real high level wrestling credentials. I've watched wrestling for a long time at the NCAA Division I level. He's one of the most dominant guys that you'll see. His ability to go out there, put people on their back. I think it was Sammy Brooks from Iowa. He pinned him with a, spladle in like a minute. It's like just doing things to top 5 guys in the country that were kind of unheard of at the time. My guy, Miles Martin, guy I love and respect, Ohio State legend. He beat Bo Nickel. And then Bo Nickel came back and pin slayed him in the first period of the national championship and then stood up and screamed, "That's why you come to Penn State." The guy has been a star for a long time, and I think that's why the UFC put him on this platform. Now, what have we seen a little bit this week? People almost want to see him get pushed off that platform, right? What happens when you start to be hyped? People want to see you fail. People hate to see a winner. They hate to see anybody who's got success. They hate to see anybody who's confident and believes in their skills. And I think that for Bo Nickel, he's got all the skills. He's got the ability to go out there and compete. I had said, prior to his Contender Series fights, this is a guy who's out there on grappling footage with black belts rolling just fine, against Gordon Ryan, obviously a different story, but against Oliver Taza and these guys, I believe it was, he's having matches on UFC Fight Pass. He's looking good. So I think that his grappling is there. I think that his wrestling is there. I think that Cody Brundage has always been a flake. And so I think that for those reasons, you have to favor Bo Nickel here quite substantially. But number one, I mentioned after the Malkoun fight that the money line side was Cody Brundage, and people gave me so much grief. And the truth is, like, it all depends on how you look at these fights. Because again, if you look at it just based on skill, like, yeah, Jacob Malkoun is way better than him. You run that fight again, Jacob Malkoun will still be better than him. But the sport will still be stupid, and it will still give people an out if they want to quit, and it will still have these weird loopholes and things where Chris Weidman can double eye poke a guy and get the win. This is MMA, baby. Welcome to the world of crazy outcomes. So I think a lot of people always look at these fights and they go, oh, it's so obvious what's going to happen. I never do that, and sometimes that will make me look like a fool, right? I'll take an underdog shot on somebody that had no hope or prayer. But in this kind of fight, if you're long-term laying minus 2,500s in the sport of mixed martial arts, what will happen is eventually you will faceplant, and it will take you 25 right answers to get back to square one. And that's why I don't do it. That's why I don't try and be Nostradamus at these kind of prices. I think it's silly. I don't think it's long-term EV. But on the other side, let's just talk about the fact that 4 times out, he's finishing everybody in the first round. He's doing everything is asked of him. He said in the interviews this week, hey, I want to get some more cage time. I'd like to see this fight extend to the second round. I'd like to get some more work in here. He said, but I don't think Brundage is going to be able to survive, the full 15 minutes with me. I agree. More often than not, that should be the case. But here's the other thing I'll say. You've got a guy who's talking about, I want to extend this fight. I want to make it go longer. I want to get some cage time. That could be a blessing or a curse. What has he been doing so well? Going out there and getting guys out of there in the first round. I think there's some value on Bo late props if he wants to take this one a little bit, if he wants to just use some wrestling techniques and flow through some positions and pick this guy up and suplex him over his head and do crazy stuff. But you know what that sometimes leads to? Guys gassing out, guys getting overconfident, guys making mistakes, guys getting finished. And so when we're not talking about flyweight, right? You got a little margin for error. You get hit with a couple shots, hey, I recover, no problem. This is the middleweight division. Tresean Gore made one mistake. Bing! Thanks for playing. Good night. Dalton Lungambula whooped the ass of Cody Brundage for as long as the fight lasted. Until what? Shoots one takedown into a guillotine. Thanks for playing. Fight's over. You look at the Rodolfo Vieira fight. This is the reason why I've always said you won't catch me betting on Cody Brundage even when he is the value side. The guy's a bonehead. Okay? He goes out there, he pulls a guillotine on Rodolfo Vieira after rocking him with punches. Idiotic. Really, really stupid thing to do. And I think that this guy is kind of a guy who panics under pressure. And I think that that's why the UFC put him in this spot. I think they'd prefer if Bo Nickel can go out there and break this guy with pressure, take him down, embarrass him a little bit. Nick Maximov was getting takedowns on this guy, putting him through some wrestling paces. Bo Nickel would do disgusting things to Nick Maximov. So when I look at this on paper, everything says Bo. But the sport's just never that easy, right? And so I think a lot of people are probably going to get burnt, whether it's on a method market, whether it's on, some way, the under 1.5 rounds, like they're going to find a way to screw people here, in my opinion. And I just feel like Bo Nickel, great talent, great prospect, but until these prices get evened out, to something more reasonable, I'll just never be laying them. I'll look for more creative ways to play the fight. I'll say one last thing from an EV standpoint. If you like Bo Nickel to win the fight by submission, take the fight ends by submission. It's the same price. If you like Bo Nickel to win the fight by knockout, take the fight to end by knockout. It's about the same price. A lot of people want to get too cute with these things. For 5 cents of value, they'd rather have Bo Nickel knockout than the ends by knockout. This is a middleweight fight. You do not want it could end in DQ. It could end in a injury, right? Bo Nickel goes to throw a kick. Oh my God, he shattered his ankle. I'm not trying to put these things out there into the universe. I'm just saying, how many times do you have to watch these fights before you realize crazy shit happens? Bill Algeo, toughest guy in the room, never gets finished. And then he goes out there against Kyle Nelson, not a prolific finisher, not a guy who's known for his huge knockout power. He does have power, but not known for that in the UFC. And he finishes him in the first round. That's the game we're playing. So I think when you look at a fight like this, Cody Brundage will have to win this fight in the first round. But I think he's a gasser. I do not like his game in extended exchanges. And here's the last thing I'll mention. He had a 15-minute fight in the UFC, and I believe he peaked in that fight with 30 significant strikes. This guy is either knocking somebody out, submitting them, or not doing anything for most of his fights. So for me, give me Bo Nickel to get the win here, probably in the second round.
Yeah, it's obvious what the UFC is doing with this matchup. They want to get Bo Nickel an impressive win to start the UFC 300 card. It's obviously going to be a high amount of viewership, and if he goes out there and gets an impressive win, whether it's a knockout or a submission early in the first, obviously that'll be in the highlight reels. It'll get people hyped. This is the way you build up your prospects and your future stars. You put them on cards that sometimes maybe they don't deserve the position they're in, but in the future, when we look back, maybe if he goes on to be a champion, for example, you won't look at him being the main card opener of UFC 300 as that big of a black eye by the UFC. A lot of times, you go back and look at old cards and go, oh, wow, this champion or this guy was on the prelims here or something. That's so surprising. But at the time, it certainly was not surprising. So I think some of the criticism that this fight has been getting for being on the main card is warranted in the sense that, yes, it's probably the worst fight on the card. But from a business perspective, people always love to dump on the UFC for their ability to mismanage stars at times. Well, this is how you properly build a star. Also, you look at the stylistic matchup that they gave Bo here. I mean, this is not the type of matchup where you go, oh man, there's going to be a challenge. Maybe it's one where he goes out there and works on a certain aspect of his game. This is a fight that they gave him to basically look as impressive as possible. I know that he's talked about in interviews that he wants to actually extend the fight. If anything, you'd like to actually get some more cage time out there. I wouldn't say he's necessarily lying with that, but put yourself in his shoes. Obviously, he has a team around him. He has marketers and all these different people in his ear. Do you think it'd be a good idea for him to go out there and get a ho-hum 30-27 decision where he worked on his positional top control and his clinch game for 15 minutes? No. What's going to be best for Bo Nickel's career is to go out there and get an effortless two-punch, 27-second KO or a club and sub type of stoppage on the ground. Like, that's ultimately what he's going to try to do here, I think. I would be surprised if he actually goes out there and legitimately tries to extend it. I think it'd be foolish for a variety of reasons, not just the marketing angle, but also why give your opponent the chance? I mean, even if you're dominating, why give him the chance to land something lucky on you? And if you're perfectly capable of getting him out of there early. So I think we'll see probably a first round stoppage here from Bo Nickel. In terms of him as a prospect, generally, I am a guy who looks to fade UFC prospects, at least the very highly touted ones, because usually they're not very good about them. The Page and Sage back in the day, or Paddy Pimblett in recent years, of course, as well. Bo Nickel's one guy, though, who I think is a legitimate elite level prospect. Doesn't mean he's going to be an elite level fighter eventually. No. But in terms of looking at actual prospects, what they bring to the table, obviously the wrestling background, the athleticism, naturally has big punching power. And say, unlike a guy like Aaron Pico in Bellator, who's shown to be very reckless in his bouts, in addition to having a poor chin, we have not seen that recklessness from Bo Nickel. Obviously, very quick fight so far, but still has not shown any kind of reckless nature to him. So in terms of looking at a prospect, take away all the hype from the UFC and ask yourself, what would make a great prospect in MMA? Well, a guy with an elite level wrestling background, who's an elite level athlete, who has a great head on his shoulders, who's confident but not cocky, and is truly dedicated to the game and improving every aspect of it. I mean, what more could you really ask for on paper? Now, maybe it turns out he has a terrible chin, totally glass. Maybe he goes out there and is a complete front runner that when he struggles in MMA, he just basically completely wilts. Maybe he has a great chin but hates getting hit. Brock Lesnar back in the day had an absolute iron chin, especially by heavyweight standards, but absolutely despised getting hit and basically would just fake go down when he took a big shot. So maybe, Bo Nickal's like that from another strong wrestling background like Lesnar. So there's obviously a lot of ways that this can still go very, very badly for Bo Nickal down the line. But as of now, in terms of what you're looking for from a prospect, he has pretty much everything you're looking for so far. So I think he's a very good prospect, not to say that guarantees him being a champion eventually, but I do think the UFC got it right in terms of picking who to hype with this one. And in this matchup, they probably knew what they were doing, and it probably should be another impressive win, probably a quick one for Bo Nickal as well. Any further thoughts on this one, Liam?
No, I'll just say, I've never really been betting on Brundage, but he is highly correlated with the unders. So for whatever that's worth, like if you believe in Bo Nickal round one or these kind of things, you can again probably find a decent enough price on the under relative to the parlay chalk on Bo, relative to the parlay chalk on Nickal round 1 and 2. These kind of things that you're really not going to see much EV. I would rather cover more outs if I'm going to lay that kind of chalk. And almost all of Brundage's win equity in any given fight is in the first 7.5 minutes. It's not to say he can't win a decision. It's just to say he doesn't do very much, right? And especially if you are thinking about like where would skill most likely present itself, it's in a longer fight. Over time, skills reveal themselves. Sometimes somebody just gets clapped with the first punch of the fight, and that's the end of the story. So for me, that was one other thing I mentioned on my show. But I also mentioned during our breakdown, this is the kind of one where it's like, if they scoop the under here, I wouldn't be that surprised because of the comments from Bo. I do agree with you. He wants to project his career forward, but I think if he goes out there, dominates Brundage in every position, beats the tar out of him, and then finishes him in the second round, I think he would get a lot of credit for that too. Especially if it's like, if he uses his footwork, he's out on the outside, he's beating him up with his strikes. He just looks clinical with his striking performance. Goes out there like a Peyton Talbot and pressures this guy all round one, and then round two kills him. I think that would be the kind of thing that gets him the big bonus and the big appreciation, but it's got to be something special. And against Cody Brundage, the table's been set, right? It's like now if he fumbles the bag, that's on him, but Brundage is a beatable fighter.
Yeah, I would say that I would not be surprised if we go to a round 2 here. I could see Bo Nickal for the reasons you mentioned. Maybe he's boxing from the outside, but the finish just hasn't quite happened yet. But in terms of like the fight going like late round 2 or into round 3, for example, that would surprise me here, just based on both of their styles, based on again the type of career that Bo has had so far, what he's trying to do from a marketing angle, but also just from a strategy angle. Again, maybe he actually does go to the second round, but I don't think that he'll end up going past that. I'd be pretty surprised if the fight went to round 3. Obviously, the odds reflect that, though, as well. Sorry, my dog is playing with a toy here. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. But the odds right now, I think it's around minus 300 to end in under 1.5. So not exactly great value there. Bo in round 1 is minus 200-ish. So again, not exactly great value. I mean, if I was looking to play the fight, I would probably do something along those lines. I don't currently have a particular inkling to play one of those, but I just feel like this is probably going to be another cakewalk for Bo. Also, I guess it is worth noting, if he is to lose, as you mentioned, and also the comment here about Brundage by sub in the first, if he were to lose Bo Nickal, it probably is going to be early on by some sort of stoppage. So if you bet the under in that case versus him Bo to win specifically in round 1, that would also cover a potential upset loss. Although obviously we're not expecting that, but it is just another base that is covered in additional to having 50% more of the time for that bet to cash. So personally, I think, again, Bo Nickal's probably going to roll here, probably going to be in the first round. As for the rest of the card, we won't go through every single fight, but we'll go through some ones that we want to touch on here. Actually have a couple of questions to get to. First, speaking of Power Slap, do you even watch Power Slap, Liam?
No, bro. I will never watch Power Slap. God bless your heart if you watch Power Slap. That's not for me, bro.
Yeah, definitely not going to be doing any Power Slap breakdowns here anytime soon. I personally don't watch it. I did tune into it one time just out of curiosity. It's not personally my cup of tea because there's not really any skill involved. It's basically just who has the best chin for the most part. But I will say the incredible criticism that it's gotten from MMA Twitter has been kind of surprising. Or it's like, it's not like these are literal slaves who they've like plucked and are forcing to go and compete in this. Like these are people who are willingly signing up, signing a contract, choosing to get paid in exchange for, yeah, probably getting CTE, but everything is their own choice. Like I don't feel like this is some, absolute crime against humanity that MMA Twitter always makes it out to be. Personally, not my cup of tea, not something I'm interested in, but people want to tune into that. If people want to compete in it, more power to them. As long as, you're not going out there and, normally I'd say hurting someone else, but I guess hurting someone else against their will, I don't really have a problem with it. In terms of the prelims here, someone asked, or I guess someone commented, Kattar going to KO Aljo. Do you have any particular thoughts on that matchup?
I spoke about not like changing your process because of the things that we've heard. I lean the fight not to go the distance in this one anyway, personally, just because I think that there's a clear path to a finish for both guys, right? Like, how does Kattar win this fight? He could maybe eke out a decision here. Both guys are capable fighters, but he's a knockout threat, and Aljo's been knocked out in most of his losses. So something to consider, or I should say most of his losses recently. Right, especially at the UFC level, at the highest level. He's lost a couple of decisions way back in the day, but that was more often than not in the grappling phases, in like weird scrambly wrestling, counter wrestling type fights. When he loses via strikes, it's normally getting knocked out brutally. And Calvin Kattar is a huge hitter. He's coming back off a knee surgery. That's why I don't feel super confident on a side. But the other thing is, there's a lot of confidence in Aljo, a lot of like, Aljo's going to run through this guy. And I think if he gets to the ground, he might, right? So like, that's why, again, I like the fight not to go the distance. I mean, it's one of the most elite back takers, the most elite finishers from the back in the UFC. But we also know, how often does it work out for guys moving up a weight class? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, especially for former champions, guys that think they have it all figured out. And I'll just leave this little last bit of narrative nation out there. Dana White is from Boston. He's not a big old fan of Aljamain Sterling, if I just had to guess, okay? They kind of had that back and forth in the media and all these things. He makes Aljo turn around on like 2.5 months notice to go fight in Boston against Sean O'Malley. Sound familiar, right? Like another Boston guy, another guy that Dana really likes. And he's kind of throwing Aljo to the wolves here. Like, yeah, if Aljo wins, big opportunity. Dana will use him happily again to try and get him killed by somebody else, at 145 for a big bag and big eyeballs and attention. But in this spot, I think he's almost doing Kattar like a personal Boston to Boston favor. Like, hey, you've done well against these guys from New York. Go out there and knock this guy out, and we'll cut you a fat check. And we'll be very happy with you, re-sign you for as many performances as you want. And that'll be that. And I think Calvin Kattar's got a style they really like. Go out there, punch people, walk forward, and not be afraid to fight. And he's fought the best guys. He's never backed down from a challenge. He's not been out-wrestled or out-grappled. This is his toughest test in that regard. But if he's not getting takedowns, I think Aljo's going to be getting whomped on the feet because Kattar hits like a truck. So.
Yeah, it's a weird one because on one hand, we have Aljo moving up to 145. Seriously looks a lot bigger as well. We have fighters move up a weight class, and people are always so interested to see, how are they going to look? And it's maybe like they put on maybe a little extra fat, or maybe they're just slightly more muscular. But this is one of the more dramatic differences we've seen so far. He seems to have legitimately put on some decent size for 145. He was already a very tall, lanky bantamweight Sterling, so curious to see how he looks at 145 overall. I've met both of them in person before. Kattar definitely seemed to be taller and bigger overall, but in terms of muscular, like in terms of who is thicker, it's definitely Aljamain Sterling. So I'd imagine he's going to have a serious strength advantage if they do get into grappling exchanges, despite the fact that Kattar may be a bit lankier overall. In terms of the grappling, obviously that's going to be Aljamain Sterling's world if it hits the mat. He's obviously a great backpacker, but also a great submission artist as well. I don't know what to expect from Kattar coming off of the war against, obviously, Max Holloway, then looked good against Giga Chikadze. Actually picked him there and bet him. He was a 3-1 underdog, so I thought people were just completely underrating what was actually a very good stylistic matchup for him. And I pointed out not to brag about picking him as the dog, but to point out I just think that was an underrated style matchup, whereas then obviously he had the leg injury. Now he has the surgery, the layoff. And this is not an easy stylistic matchup for him. So concerns about the Holloway potentially, that fight kind of maybe doing some long-term damage for him. Obviously has a lot of fight years up on his record at this point. So I do have legitimate concerns about Cater being not necessarily shot, but maybe on the decline. Now, obviously, again, we are in a post-USADA era, so potentially that can help with his recovery. But I just don't know quite what to expect from Cater. And on paper, even if we're getting the best version of him, while he certainly has the better striking overall, he has certainly the better durability, more powerful of a puncher as well. I would definitely say the grappling is a huge, huge concern, even for prime Cater here. So Cater, then when you're talking about the injury as well, on top of that, it gets a bit sketchy for me here. So it's not a fight where I love Aljamain Sterling because he still has very poor striking defense. His chin, obviously, as we saw against O'Malley, is a bit shaky. I certainly think that was an early stoppage, but the way that Sterling just basically dove headfirst into that punching exchange that got him slept. I mean, even O'Malley said afterwards he couldn't believe how Sterling just handed him the counter on an absolute silver platter, especially knowing that's exactly the counter that O'Malley would be looking for. So Sterling, not exactly the best chin we've seen in the past from him, not exactly the best striking defense. And even going against a guy who is basically a pure striker, he'll still go out there and put himself in some precarious positions. So I favor Sterling certainly in the matchup, but not really one that I'm thrilled from in terms of a betting perspective. I actually do want to run back through this fight again, either tonight or tomorrow. My lean is towards Sterling, but as of now, I will not be betting it. But maybe after some further research, I could potentially come around on that. Is there any other prelim fights that are noteworthy that you want to talk about here, Liam? Obviously, a great card overall, but any that are particularly noteworthy to you?
I don't think tremendously so. I think that it's a great card, a lot of balanced and great fights. More of my action right now is centered on the main card for sure. I do have one play on the preliminary card, a prop bet, one of my most profitable fighters ever. So trying to pick my spots accordingly on the preliminaries here. But again, this is like a championship level fight, two girls that are both very high quality. So there's a hint for you in terms of what fight it is. But yeah, I think I'll leave that one for subs because the price has been coming down pretty considerably. And I don't want to mush the market any further than it has been in that regard. But what I think is, there's going to be a lot of great fights, but don't overextend. Right? Take it one fight at a time. Enjoy the card. Make sure you do that. Pick some fights where you're like, you know what? I'm not going to bet this one. I'm going to enjoy it because not every fight has to be a betting opportunity. One of your advantages as the player in a gambling scenario is they have to hang a line. You don't have to bet it. So if you think you have an edge, if you think you have value, if you think that you're getting the best of it, take that number. If you don't think so, leave it alone. Enjoy the fights. It's a great card. Most of the time you have to, put a bet on these fights to even watch them, right? Because they're terrible. That's not the case with these. These are high quality. You're going to enjoy it. You're going to get something from it. And I think it's going to be a great card. So I'm excited for it, man.
Yeah, I very much agree. Like I said earlier, it's maybe not necessarily, it's kind of actually a disappointing card in the sense of, again, the headliner is not that superstar power type of a matchup, but man, top to bottom, pretty much every fight on this is absolutely fantastic. Several main event worthy fights, at least for fight nights and even some pay-per-views as well. So certainly excited for the card top to bottom. I do think, though, that as you mentioned, the prelims start to get trickier from a betting perspective, not just because of some of the fighters involved, but also because of some of the lines. I do have some opinions on some of the prelims in terms of some leans. Again, I want to look more into that tonight. But as of now, I definitely feel not necessarily stronger about the main card in terms of conviction about who's going to win the matchups, because obviously, as we talked about, some of them are actually close on paper. But I have greater conviction in terms of how I think the matchups are likely to go. Whereas some of the prelim fights, I'm kind of like, I'm not sure if it's going to be the striking. I'm not sure it's going to be the grappling. I'm not sure who has the advantage in some of the areas. I just think in general, the prelims are a trickier bag to try to sort out. I guess the last fight we'll talk about here is what are you expecting from not necessarily the debut of Kayla Harrison, but her long-term prospects in the UFC?
I didn't like the weigh-in. I didn't like that visual. I'm not sure how she's going to recover. Didn't like the idea of forcing her down to 135. She's a disciplined athlete. I think she's going to do everything within her power to perform and to show up great. But honestly, man, I don't think there's a recipe for success. I would never lay the minus 450 to find out if it is, right? She's competing at 155 in, other organizations, 145, I think one time in Invicta, another 10 pounds, used to compete in judo at 170 pounds and above. Sounds like a disaster for me. So yeah, I think that it's encouraging the wrong things, right? To young athletes as well. Like do whatever your promoter says, cut all the weight in the world, destroy your body. She's a young woman, probably shouldn't be doing this, but she is because she wants the opportunity, because she wants a chance to prove it. Holly Holm has looked like a diminished version of herself in her most recent fight, but I ask you this question as well. What is your level of motivation to go fight Myra Bueno Silva in the UFC Apex Center when you're a former world champion multiple times over? Probably zero. You're probably not getting up for that fight. You don't care. And you're just thinking to yourself, man, if I just last 2 rounds, she's going to gas out anyway. It'd be an easy win for me. And she got caught in the first 2 rounds. By the way, I bet Myra Bueno Silva there. I picked her to win that fight. Thought she was the heavier handed woman. And I was like, man, if you're heavier handed and, Holly Holm can't really mix up the clinch with you, what is she going to do? Like, I was just like, she's going to have a tough time here. And against Kayla Harrison, I'll just say this, man. I watched that Larissa Pacheco fight, and Larissa Pacheco is a great fighter, but her striking looks stiff and rigid and awkward, and she did not look very impressive. So what is she good at? She's good at double leg takedowns. She's good at judo. I think that what separates her from Ronda, she's good at double leg takedowns. She can mix in doubles and singles and kind of knows how to wrestle for MMA. American top team girl, better trained, a little bit better positionally. That's it. I think that her lethality with the armbar is not as significant. I think that, she's more likely to win this fight via ground and pound elbows, in my opinion, which a lot of people are saying the opposite. Holm does give her neck sometimes. She's got a long ass neck. She could get submitted. But I think that for Kayla Harrison, it's going to want to do damage, open up, elbow from on top if she can get it there. But I think the other way this fight could play out is, number one, she gets no takedowns at all and gets embarrassed because we've seen that one time before with a judo girl who had a lot of hype and everybody really believed in. Her name was Ronda Rousey. It's the only time Holly Holmes ever won as an underdog. She never came close to a takedown. She threw her all over the place because Holly, for all her faults, is very physical in the clinch. That's like her whole game. And especially in recent years, it's become more and more a piece of her game. And the thing about it is, for me, Kayla Harrison, it would be wise to go low, right? Shoot shots low on the body, take her down with 2 knees together, pick her up sideways, slam her into side control. That's what you want to do if you're Kayla Harrison. Because if you go out there and you're attempting, like, I'm going to go for underhooks, I'm going to grab a hold of it, Holly Holm will move you around there. She's boxed her whole life. The one thing that I had thought, separated her against Ronda is the fact that she has really good clinch breaks from boxing. It's like in boxing, if you want to be able to work your length, be the longer fighter from further away, kickboxing as well, you got to be able to break out of these clinches. And that's what we saw from her there. And by the way, Ronda was falling all over the place. Her footwork fell apart completely because it became a striking fight that she was uncomfortable in. Kayla Harrison, her footwork fell apart when she was fighting Larissa Pacheco because she couldn't be a bully, because she couldn't be on the front foot the whole time, and she was starting to get beat up and question herself. Now, I think Larissa Pacheco would probably put Holly Holm in a body bag, like a lot of people told me this week. I agree with that sentiment. But I also think that styles make fights. And this is a big girl. This isn't Larissa Pacheco, my height, this tall off the ground playing. But you're like, Holly Holm's a big woman. She's very strong. By the way, what did we just talk about before? Post USADA. USADA's gone, right? She trains at Jackson Wink in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Ever heard of it? I know a UFC champion that used to train there. How about the fact that she trains with Izzy Style Wrestling? She's getting privates in with the Albuquerque coach of Gracie Baja, and she's got Chris Cyborg in her camp. She literally flew out Chris Cyborg, paying to have her in her camp, as far as I understand. So, yeah, she's investing in this camp to go out there and do a sell job for Kayla Harrison. Here's the other thing. You're sitting in UFC headquarters. I think everybody's impression is this. We're signing Kayla Harrison because we think she's going to be so great and we want her to dominate and we want her to look so good. And I think the opposite could be true. I think that could be true. That is one plausible theory of the case. It's like, hey, we just invested in her. Let's build up this asset. Is it not a drop in the bucket to pay Kayla Harrison a boatload of money to get her embarrassed one time in the UFC? And then you say, don't you watch PFL? Don't you watch Bellator? Don't you watch any of these other promotions? It's UFC. It's always been UFC. It will always be UFC. Our 42-year-old former champions dominate the girls that you think are all that outside the UFC. Is that better marketing for the UFC? Or is Kayla Harrison coming in emaciated at 135 pounds and winning a fight and maybe not being able to make the weight again consistently? Is that better for business? I don't know. You tell me. I mean, I think it could go either way. So if you're asking me, who would I rather put a bet on? Holly Holm. And I know that could sound silly. Guys, I've been fading Holly Holm throughout her career. Plus 200 on Ketlen Vieira. Go through the list. It's plus money in women's MMA. I'm going to take it. I'm going to live with the result. I'm going to find out. Plus 350 on the UFC champion against the girl from PFL. I mean, I think that it could go really badly for her. But at plus 330, those are the kind of results you got to live with, right? You got to be willing to rip up those tickets more often than not. But I'm just saying, like, if I told you we're in round 2 and Kayla Harrison is not on top, how good are you feeling about laying minus 450? That's the only question I'd ask.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying about like the whole tinfoil hat conspiracy theory about just making her basically lose here. A couple of things make me kind of wonder about that. One, why are you forcing her to go to 135? Like, why not have her fight at 145 at least? That's a bit strange. And you look back, say Cyborg back in the day. Speaking of her, well, she was in a very similar position to Kayla Harrison. She had one loss outside of the UFC. She was overall very dominant. People have been wanting to see her in the UFC for years upon years. She finally comes over and obviously had some early success, but then eventually gets nuked by Amanda Nunes, and the UFC basically didn't give a damn about her anymore. Like, she was still actively fighting and stuff. The UFC just didn't want anything to do. It's almost like they just only signed her basically to have her lose and be like, yeah, no one outside the UFC matters. It was a very strange handling of her career. And even she said in interviews and stuff, like, she seems kind of antagonistic a bit towards the UFC. Like, she wasn't happy with how things went there behind the scenes. Also, in the case of Harrison, it's worth noting, who the hell has this woman fought? I know Larissa Pacheco, as you mentioned, would probably beat Holly Holm at this point in time. She's definitely improved during her time in PFL, but it is worth noting Pacheco is still a UFC cast-off, as have been most of the good wins, quote-unquote, for Kayla Harrison so far. I mean, it's basically Invicta or UFC cast-offs that she's beat so far. And when you look through her record, sometimes you look through a fighter's record and be like, who has she fought? Because you're actually like legitimately asking, who have they fought? You don't recognize the people. I recognize lots of people she's fought. Caitlin Young, Cindy Dandois, again, Pacheco, as I mentioned. I mean, her most recent win after the loss to Pacheco, Aspen Ladd. I mean, these are not particularly high-quality opponents. And if Holly Holm is actually in good form, aside from, again, maybe Pacheco, the other fighters Holly Holm would beat at this point in time if she was in good form. These are not good fighters that, for the most part, Harrison has been beating and dominating. So we're talking about, now that she's in the UFC, it's going to be a step up overall in competition compared to what she faced in PFL. We're also talking about now an extreme weight cut, which doesn't make sense why the UFC would want that for her. And now also the bright lights, everything that goes with the UFC. It's not that I think Harrison's going to be distracted or camera shy, but there's a lot more media that's involved. Obviously, making her debut on UFC 300 is not exactly ideal. I mean, great for marketing, but in terms of the extra pressure, the extra obligations and all that, talking about absolutely maximum distractions here. So I definitely have some concerns about Harrison, not necessarily just in this one fight, but honestly, her career in the UFC, she's going to continue to be at 35. In terms of this specific matchup, Holly Holm in her prime, maybe, I'd have a better thoughts about, actually going out and winning the fight, but she has not looked good in recent years. As you mentioned, has she really had motivation to look good against, Bueno Silva in the Apex, as you mentioned? No, certainly not, but she's also ancient for the female divisions. She's up there in age generally for MMA fighters, period. And again, on top of that, she's not looked good. Her chin has been fading. Her chin was actually never great. So there are just a variety of reasons here to doubt what Holly Holm's actually going to bring to the table. But again, in a post-USADA era, potentially maybe she can turn back the clock. It's something I mentioned earlier on the podcast. You have to be concerned about with these aging veterans. If they're having their first fight in 2024, they may have a turn back the clock type of performance. So, man, for a variety of reasons, I cannot get behind 5-1 here on Kayla Harrison. It's not that I don't think she's the better overall fighter at this point in time. It's not that I don't think she has the higher upside going forward, even if Holly Holm is juiced to the gills. I think Kayla Harrison probably would have the better career going forward, assuming she's not absolutely destroying herself to get down to 135 here. But man, this is kind of a wait and see type of performance for me. I really am going to wait to see what we get out of Harrison for the variety of reasons I just mentioned before I want to judge what I actually expect from her going forward. If she goes out there and looks bad in this matchup, gasses, looks just unexplosive, drained from the weight cut, just looks bad in terms of technique, that's going to say a lot, I think. But if she goes out there and absolutely torches Holm, looks just as good as ever, completely dominates her despite the distractions, despite the weight cut, well, we might actually be having a future dominant champion on our hands here. But anything to add further to that, Liam?
Nah, I'm good, man.
Anything else to add then before we get out of here?
Nope.
A man, a few words. It's been a long day. We've both been hard at work this week, one of our busier weeks researching all of these fights for you guys. So hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. Thank you for all of your questions and comments throughout the way here. Of course, remember, we have a bunch more content over on the Patreon. That is patreon.com/Fury's Fight Picks, as you can see there on the bottom of the screen. Liam has some cheat sheet articles up with all sorts of stats, trends, fight study, notes and everything. In-depth breakdowns. I have a pick article where I did a breakdown for the main card. We also have a staff picks article going up later today that will have all of the picks along with a win method from the variety of staff over on the Patreon. So you can check out all that content. Also, the fight film episode for Alex Poeton here as well. So tons of content, too much for even me to remember here. So check it all out over on patreon.com/Fury's Fight Picks. Also be back for a post-fight podcast this weekend to break down the action. Hopefully it's a good one for your bets as well as ours. Good luck on everything. Hopefully we'll see you over on the Patreon. Until then, for Liam, I'm Luca Fury, and thank you for watching.